So for our penultimate session on the theme of counterterrorism, a wicked problem, we're fortunate enough to have two razor-sharp minds at our disposal. So in the CSS corner, we have Professor Dan Byman, professor here in the School of Foreign Service, with concurrent appointment in the Department of Government, as well as also a former director of CSS. It's a great pleasure to meet Dan finally in person and to see that he is recognizably human. I must have begun to think that he can't sleep since he produces heavyweight, academic and provocative, excellent books at a sort of rate of production that some presidents tweet provocative and inflammatory messages. A truly extraordinary production rate of, well, at last glance, I think it was 16 books, but I may have missed a couple that came out since 15 or 16, I believe. Serious heavyweight contributions across numerous fronts, including Deadly Connections, States That Sponsor Terrorism, Cambridge University Press, 2005. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State and the Global Jihadist Movement, What Everyone Needs to Know, a subtitle that the book actually lives up to, Oxford 2015, and say most recently, I believe, Road Warriors, Foreign Fighters in the Armies of Jihad, Oxford 2019. So Dan will speak first, but they'll be followed by in the CSTPV corner. I'm going to claim him from CSTPV, even though he is now, of course, at Queen's University Belfast. But I'm going to then hand over to Professor Richard English, Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Internationalisation and Engagement at Queen's University Belfast, but a very old friend of CSTPV, one of our esteemed honorary professors, indeed, my predecessor as Centre Director, and so I know what good shape he handed the Centre over to me in. Richard has built a reputation as the world's leading academic authority on the provisional IRA before branching out with such landmark contributions to the wider study of terrorism and counterterrorism, including Terrorism, How to Respond, 2009, and Does Terrorism Work? A History, 2016, both with Oxford University Press. So two genuinely heavyweight contributors to lead us through this penultimate session. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan. I assume that you may well both speak sitting, is that right? It's only myself who needs to keep myself awake by standing up, but we'll be informal. So over to you, Dan.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for those very kind remarks. It's really a great pleasure to be here and see not only so many distinguished colleagues, but also so many former students who are now very impressive professionals themselves. My wife once compared hearing about counterterrorism for me as getting her counterterrorism news from a golden retriever. That I tend to be a bit on the optimistic side. And so when I heard Nick Rasmussen speak about the glass being at times half empty and at times half full, depending on the mood that the country was in, I would emphasize that I think if we look at the full post 9/11 arc, the glass actually might be a bit more full than we often think. There are many problems, right? I don't want to dismiss that. There are continued dangers. We've heard about them for the last day and a half, and we'll probably hear more about them for the conclusion of the conference. But nevertheless, there's been some very impressive successes that I think are worth talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape. I'll talk a little bit about some of the instruments, and then I'll talk a little bit about state sponsorship. So an obvious point, but the Islamic State has been hit very hard, right? And we can talk about the going underground, we can talk about the ideology, we can talk about all these things as very real things, but if you compare it to 2015, things are much better in 2019, right? And there are people in this room who should take a bow for that, right? That's not something that happened by chance. That was a series of policy decisions by a range of governments around the world. And that's a success. It's led to the decline in its ideology in terms of the appeal of the caliphate. The number of volunteers have gone down. The financial resources have gone down. These are considerable successes. We've also seen a decline in top-down orchestrated attacks on the West. Right? That's very important because the top-down orchestrated attacks historically have been much more lethal. Right? So bottom-up attacks can be lethal. There are numerous examples. But on average, top-down attacks are more deadly and serve a more strategic purpose. That's a positive. If you're taking a very selfish American point of view, which as an American I tend to do from time to time, things look even better. Right? The number of foreign fighters who have attacked the US homeland since 9/11 is 0. Right? In 2018, there was 1 American killed on the US homeland from jihadist terrorism. Some of you may know about the fearsome sleepover attack that involved several teenagers. Right? I'm being a bit facetious, but this is not something that should be keeping anyone up at night. In 2019, at the very end, we had 3 people die when a Saudi cadet killed several others. Very tragic. But I think if you asked Nick Rasmussen, maybe try to get a few beers in first. But if you asked him about what he and his colleagues were thinking about in the days after 9/11, that was not the level of danger they were fearful of. Right? They were concerned about things like a 9/11 attack or something comparable, or even like a Paris in 2015, happening on a regular basis. Right? And that does not. And that to me is a success, even though we should talk about the power of inspiration. We should talk about the spread of the ideology. We should talk about how there are more groups in more places. All that is danger, but those are very different dangers, right? Those are dangers in part to U.S. foreign policy. I'm glad that Nick brought up the question of how to think about Niger, right? Some of you may have followed in a similar vein that there's an Islamic State presence in Congo, right? Very tiny one, but it's there. It's a legitimate question of how much people should care. Right? The response to 4 million Congolese dying in the Congolese Civil War was a global collective shrug. Right? So this is not an area that has inspired tremendous national interest concerns over the years. And there is a danger, I think, for all my disagreements with President Trump, I think he has at times tried to articulate a concern about the idea of a forever war. Right? And I tend to get most of my news from The Onion. Right? And The Onion does talk about, it's a wonderful article that talks about a young Marine is very excited to have his father's patrol route in Afghanistan. Right? And that's a rather painful headline. Right? But unfortunately, it's a true headline. Right? And we need to recognize that. I would say on state sponsorship that although there are problems, as I'll discuss, we do not have a highly ideological state out there spreading revolution. So there's no Gaddafi after the revolution there. There's no Iran after the revolution there. There's no Soviet Union that's trying to spread global Marxist revolution. Right? Again, doesn't mean there isn't a problem, but this is to some degree a success. I would foot stomp the concerns about the white supremacist movement that I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm glad that people are talking about the incels in the context of terrorism. Right? And I would emphasize that a lot of the dangers of these are not just terrorism, but the broader poison they spread through society. Right? So I don't want to be too optimistic. But I think sometimes in the counterterrorism or in the terrorism realm, we rush to emphasize the next danger without recognizing some of the successes. And just to go through some of the instruments, right? Law enforcement, which was much derided after 9/11, has actually proven remarkably successful in both the United States and Europe. Right? And that's because when jihadists have difficulty getting training overseas, right, when we talk about people who are bottom up, they tend to be highly incompetent. Right? Now, in the United States, as was mentioned, there is the advantage of easy access to firearms. Right? And almost half the deaths from a jihadist attack in the United States occurred in one attack, which was a Pulse nightclub attack, which was someone who was by no means a trained, indoctrinated, lethal shooter. Right? And in Europe, that person would have stabbed a few people and probably killed a few people, but would have been a very different sort of attack. Right? But in general, the huge numbers of people have been successfully disrupted by aggressive law enforcement, and most turned in by a supportive American Muslim community. Right? That was another concern people had after 9/11, was that there was going to be a broader, deeper problem in society. And in the United States, it's actually been the opposite. Right? It's even the Pulse nightclub attack, which I mentioned as a failure. Right? This was a case where members of the Muslim community in Florida called the FBI beforehand and said, there's a problem here. Right? Something is going on with this individual. And that's a tremendous success, even though the outcome was tremendously tragic. Right? We should recognize that tremendous success. I would emphasize the role of intelligence cooperation in much of this success. Right? Again, I'll just say thanks to the people in this room I know, but especially those I don't know, because I think a lot of it is the relationships that have been forged. And this has led to really a global machine that has gone after a range of groups, especially jihadist groups, around the world, putting pieces together that haven't been put together before. Gina Bennett is here, and I won't pick on her, But ask her how many people were working on the jihadist threat before 9/11, right? Certainly fewer than the people in this room, right? I have no idea what the number is right now, but we could say thousands, right? It's a massive change. And believe it or not, the American taxpayer has gotten something for that money, right? Around the world, we see huge increases in budgets, in personnel, and again, especially cooperation. Anyone who has worked the cooperation issue knows there's always more to be done. But there's far more information shared. It's far more effectively shared. It's shared in a timely way. And again, tremendous disruption. I would highlight, though, a broader foreign policy cost, which is when the United States is working with allied governments, especially in the Muslim world, where it's often most necessary, you're working with the least democratic part of an undemocratic government, right? The same security services that go after terrorists also go after legitimate, peaceful opposition, right? And it's very hard to give them computers and training and skills and say, just use it for one set of bad guys, not for the people you consider the enemy, right? So our counterterrorism campaign has real costs. The cost is in trade-offs in other areas. Drones. We can talk about terrorist safe havens and terrorist safe havens spreading, but many terrorist groups don't feel that way, right? When you look at the internal correspondence, they are tremendously concerned about being killed by a drone strike, right? And they have very good reason to. The number of people who have been killed is quite high, and the disruption effect is twofold, right? One is that anyone who has ever had a rapid succession of new managers knows just how fun their organization becomes, right? Where people are coming in and out at a rapid pace. It's very hard to run an organization with constant leadership change. But I think even more importantly, the cost of hiding is extremely high. That individuals cannot communicate, they can't meet, and as a result, you can't run a Georgetown club, and you certainly can't run a global clandestine terrorist organization with a high degree of effectiveness. We often tend to see their organizational changes in the light of what they're trying to do, when it's often, in fact, a reflection of some US counterterrorism successes. I want to, however, agree very strongly with Mary Habeck's criticism yesterday of military training. Military training is something I'm for. I believe the US should be trying to improve capacity. But there should be very realistic limits about what can be accomplished. You're moving the needle a few degrees. You're not taking a country, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq, and suddenly transforming their forces into highly capable, independent forces, right? So this is a set of programs that I think is still worthwhile, but I think we need to recognize that handing things off, as much as the United States would like to do, is extremely risky. The idea war, right? This is something that is a really tricky one, and my opinion on it changes every 5 years, so you can quote this back to me later on. But in general, we're dealing with a relatively small subset of a population, right? So remember, in the United States, more than half of people 18 to 34 don't trust vaccines to work. Okay? Think about that, right? So scientifically proven, scientific consensus, something that's been done to them for the most part successfully, and they're very skeptical of vaccines, right? And that's 50% in a relatively educated area, right? To say that it's really, that 1% of a population is believing crazy ideas to the point of violence, or more realistically, 1/100th of 1%, right? That's a very strong challenge when it comes to changing ideas, right? Because you're dealing with minority ideas. So programs that try to change broader opinion don't actually have much effect. And so it's very hard to do, and it's especially hard for governments to do. It was mentioned that it's hard for middle-aged men to craft a compelling narrative. I would argue it's hard for a State Department to craft a compelling narrative, just in part because the way things work in government, you can't respond in real time, right? That we don't want a GS-12 crafting the narrative for the entire US government, right? But if we're going to say that shouldn't be done, that person has to check with her boss, who checks with her boss, all the way up the chain. And that means that 4 days later, you have a snappy response to a tweet, which is really kind of useless, right? So it's, I think, bureaucratically hard. Very briefly on social media, I think in some ways this is revolutionary for a range of terrorist groups, regardless of ideology. It's a very cheap way to communicate. You can communicate many to many. You can proselytize, you can direct operations. However, it's also a counterintelligence disaster, right? A huge part of terrorism intelligence, I don't think this is a secret, is simply finding out who is related to whom. What are the connections, right? And there used to be a huge amount of time and attention spent on that very basic question. Now, if you are on Twitter or Facebook, you have put yourself into link analysis software, right? You have done the job that the government has wanted people to do for so long, right? So you've displayed all your connections, and often you reveal lots of nodes or links that weren't publicly known before, right? A big question in the past was, how do you know a terrorist before he blows something up? Now the answer is he tweets about it, right? And I know you think that's silly, but there have been huge numbers of arrests in the last 5 years of individuals who tweet about what they're going to do, who brag on Facebook about how they're going to kill people, who talk about how they're off to Syria. And it's because these are largely people who are undisciplined, young people who are used to thinking that the 50 people on their Facebook feed are all their friends when they're not. Right? And this again and again has proven a tremendous weakness. The caveat, though, is people have to be looking. Right? So the social media companies have enjoyed tremendous success either cooperating with law enforcement or taking down accounts. But when they're paying us attention, as in the incel case, or have very, I'll say, conflicted policies, as in the white supremacist space, they're much less effective. And the benefit goes tremendously to the violent side rather than the counterterrorism side, because the pressure is not there. Okay. Very briefly on state-sponsored terrorism. A thing that should be noted is the U.S. government list, as I think most people in this room know, is actually quite bad. Right? It's really a tough call whether there are more states on the list who don't deserve to be there or more states that should be there that aren't listed. Right? So you have Sudan that's listed, and Sudan is an absolutely loathsome government, let's be clear. But the listing under the U.S. State Department kind of talks about how cooperative Sudan is on counterterrorism. Right? That's kind of its great crime. Right? But it's on there because it's a loathsome government. On the other hand, Pakistan is in year 1 million of supporting terrorist groups yet not being on the list. Right? And I don't think there's any question that Pakistan is a tremendous supporter of terrorism, arguably the world's greatest. You can debate that, but it's certainly in the ring for the prize as a possibility, but not listed. It's also very unclear what is counted. Right? So sometimes assassinations are counted. Right? If so, Russia should be on the list. Right? So there's a host of I'll say, analytic concerns. But the biggest problem to me is that the scope of state support is not closely followed. Right? So it tends to be a very binary list. Are you a sponsor, yes or no? As opposed to how extensive is that sponsorship? And as a result, you have countries that play a relatively small role that are in the same camp as those like Iran that play a much bigger role. My personal pet peeve, though, is an issue that my label for it is simply passive sponsorship. And when you go back to kind of the pre-9/11 era, we could talk about Saudi Arabia, where, in my judgment, the government itself was not supporting jihadist terrorism, and in fact was trying to fight it. However, it was tolerating a wide array of causes and individuals linked to jihadist terrorism. Right? So the problem was the government passivity. Its unwillingness to stop fundraising, its unwillingness to stop proselytizing, its limits to cooperation with other governments, a host of things that were deliberate inaction. The Saudis have gotten better. There's still a lot of problems, but have gotten better. But I want to highlight that, which I think I've seen some heads nod, because I would put the U.S. in that category when it comes to a lot of white supremacist terrorism. Right? That there was a lot of proselytizing, certainly the ability to gather weapons. You can use U.S. social media companies. There is a host of things you can do organizationally in the United States for white supremacy. Now that we have an amendment first, and we have another amendment, the second, that are tremendously important when we talk about how to stop that in the United States. But nevertheless, it's worth pointing out that when we think about the dangers of sponsorship, it's something that I think really requires America to consider its own policies. And this gets very important to go back to the social media companies when we talk about them, because these are global actors. Right? So these are companies that are acting not only in the United States and Europe, but also throughout the world. And they need some ability to be able to draw on a list, to be draw on consistent policies. Otherwise, things are going to be jumbled. I will close by really commenting on a point that Nick Rasmussen made when he talked about the white supremacist group. And what I would emphasize there is part of the reason I'm concerned is not just the lethality, which I think a fairly effective counterterrorism campaign could curtail, certainly not stop, but curtail, but the political impact, right? And that's really what we talk about when we talk about with some of the biggest impacts of terrorism. In the United States and in many European countries, a lot of the white supremacist cause is interwoven with broader political concerns. Right? So, at least to my knowledge, there is no large Americans for Sharia law organization. Right? We don't have a peaceful organization that is pushing that. However, we have plenty of peaceful organizations that push ideas on immigration, ideas on racial equity, ideas on sexual identity that are quite in keeping with the ideas of many violent people. Right? And how to think about that context, because when you have an attack that does happen, the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue, for example, it immediately gets thrown up in US politics, right? On the question of President Trump, his supporters, criticism of those people. And one of the few good things, perhaps the only good thing about the jihadist terrorist attack was that in the past it would lead Americans to come together, right? There was a real time of unity. And we're not seeing that with the white supremacist attacks, and therefore the political impact is greater. And that's something that kind of takes my golden retriever out of the room and leaves me quite concerned. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan, for an excellent, provocative, and wonderfully timed survey. If that is your counterterrorism news as delivered by a golden retriever, then I don't know what it would look like delivered by your pet Rottweiler. I'm about to hand over then to Richard, who famously has a bulldog called Watson. Think through that analogy. So by implication, we expect some Holmesian type analysis. No pressure, Richard, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. I wasn't going to mention the dog, but now that you've mentioned Watson, I mean, bulldogs often look fierce, but I can say on this campus that they're affectionate and fundamentally very loyal creatures. And I think you should bear that in mind. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Bruce, for the honour of inviting me to be at this wonderful conference. It's, as ever, a pleasure to be here. And knowing the wisdom that there is in the audience, I look forward tremendously to the questions afterwards. I am struck that it's a Friday afternoon. Some years ago, I was doing a lecture on a Friday afternoon at another distinguished American university, and in the front row, there was someone who fell soundly and loudly asleep during my lecture and snored most of the way through it. And when at the end of my lecture, people graciously applauded, this guy then woke up and asked a really good question, having not... So I have no objection if you fall asleep, but I do expect a good question if you're snoring through it. Does counterterrorism work? Does counterterrorism work? That's the examination question I've set myself for this short talk. Echoing through what we've been hearing through the wise reflections of the last day and a half is a really profound reality, which is that terrorism and counterterrorism exist in a paradoxical, mutually shaping intimacy. It's a blood-stained game of chess, and every move that one player makes affects that which the other player thinks they can do, thinks it's legitimate to do, thinks it's necessary to do, thinks is now a more constrained set of moves, or maybe has opened up a flank of possibility. And if there's one thing you take from my talk this afternoon, let it be this, that we can't understand terrorism or counterterrorism unless we look simultaneously at both and at the relationship between them. It's absolutely essential to the diminution of terrorism, and we've heard a lot about that, and I would echo what Dan and others have said about the incredible work done by people in this room and elsewhere in counterterrorism to save life and limb. Sometimes the exacerbation of terrorism, and I'll come on to that later on. Sometimes the sustenance of terrorism, and in the history of terrorism, sometimes contributing to its generation. There is a profound relationship between these two phenomena, and we have to look at them together. What I'm going to do is make 3 points, each in the form of questions, and I hope that in what I say, there'll be some material which stimulates responses, disagreements, questions, and points. So as we think about does counterterrorism work, first, what would working mean in relation to counterterrorism? What would working actually mean in relation to counterterrorism? Now, one response would be that it's obvious that over a measurable period, if the number of attacks, if the number of deaths, if the number of injuries goes down, then counterterrorism is working. If it doesn't, then it's not. And there is a serious mindedness to that answer. It's obviously a non-trivial answer. But I don't find it in itself a satisfactory one. For example, proving that the absence or even the diminution of terrorist incidents has actually been caused by counter-terrorist policies is not a straightforward thing. It's difficult to prove causation in complex human interactions. Scholars like Ned Lebow have written rather brilliantly on this, but it's common in all areas of endeavour, but certainly in terrorism, that it's hard to be certain that it's the counter-terrorism rather than other phenomena, contextual, international, to do with economics, to do with identity changes, to do with things over which you have less control, which have made the difference. It's also true that a small number of attacks and even a small number of deaths can have a disproportionately large and damaging effect, psychologically, politically, in terms of the ways in which societies or parts of societies feel in terms of polarization. It's also true, and this came up in Nick Rasmussen's excellent talk, that there's a distinction between short and long-term effects. You might engage in counter-terrorist acts which have the short-term effect of diminishing instances of terrorism, but which plant the seeds from which longer-term grievances, blowback, and hostilities and violence endure. One of the interesting things about the timelines is that the timelines, particularly in wonderful democratic countries like this one, of the politicians and the timelines of the terrorist organizations and adversaries we're concerned with are very different. Normally much, 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 much longer with the other lot. I wrote a book on the IRA some years ago, and one of my interviewees was a New York-based Irish gun runner for the IRA, and I normally started my interviews with these people asking about how they first became involved, where it all started for them and the beginnings, and he began the interview by answering that question by saying it really began in the 12th century. And I thought, this is going to be a long interview with this bloke, but I knew what he meant. The timeline was a very, very long one. Regional variation is also significant. One might be able to say that there are fewer attacks within one's own jurisdiction, which possibly an organisation one works for has had a significant responsibility for. Good answer. But if the policies which have ensured that have led to a larger number of incidents elsewhere, that is a consideration in terms of does counter-terrorism work. If one takes the view, as I do, bulldog owner though I am, that all human life, whether it's in one country or another, has the possibility of being equally precious. So what I'm going to argue for, and this is a theme which I'm glad has come up, and it came up in what Dan Byman has said, and it came up in what's been said earlier today and yesterday. I'm frustrated by binary answers to important questions. I think what we probably need when we're asking what would working mean in relation to counterterrorism is some kind of framework that allows for a layered, complex set of simultaneous possibilities rather than a simple yes or no. I mean, Dan's written brilliantly on Israeli counter-terrorism and has pointed out that a yes or no in terms of effectiveness is simply unpersuasive because both are simultaneously involved, often arising from the same actions. What I'm going to argue is that there's a fourfold layered set of workings that you might think of, which sometimes work against each other and sometimes work to reinforce one another, but which help us to framework our understanding of the efficacy of counterterrorism. And because I'm talking about terrorism and counterterrorism as being things you look at synoptically, it's no surprise to those few of you who've read my book, Does Terrorism Work? To know that I'm going to have my attractively priced book, Does Terrorism Work? Available as we speak. To those of you who decide to purchase rather than listen, that there's a fourfold layered frame which I think is equally applicable, albeit in different ways, to counter-terrorism. One level of success would be what you call strategic success, okay, where you won't get rid of terrorism, but you might get rid of a particular adversary. It'll normally take time, but the organisation you're fighting simply gets to the point where it doesn't any longer exist or pose a threat. That's rare and takes a long time to wait for. A second level, which is more common, is what I would call strategic but partial strategic success, okay, where you don't get rid of the organisation or its threat, but you so turn down the flame that you do what Nick Rasmussen was talking about, where containment means mitigation. I live and work in Belfast. On a daily basis in Belfast, there are still organisations trying to carry out terrorist attacks, but the flame has been so lowered that it's a transformative strategic success for the state in terms of counter-terrorism because it's become a comparatively, for the moment, negligible threat compared to that which obtained during the 1970s and 1980s. But in addition to the two strategic levels, there's a tactical level. You might have operational successes where you prevent a particular attack. where you prevent a particular loss of life, where you've got interim concessions where a group might not stop, but you get them to be on ceasefire for a time, where you got a strengthening of your own organisation, where people rallied round the state because of counterterrorism. Now, the point about this is coming to my second question, which is in terms of what scholars have studied around counter-terrorist efficacy. Does this framework, a layered one, strategic success, partial strategic success, tactical successes, and then fourthly, the level of inherent rewards, that there might be money in making certain things which are tactically useful in counterterrorism. Not all counterterrorism is about countering terrorism. I gave a lecture in San Diego some years ago, and afterwards a man came up to me who ran a firm making drones. He was having a good war on terror, regardless of what the outcome was, because of the economic benefits of what was happening. And that's a non-trivial effect. Does that framework help us in answer to the second question, which is, what do scholars say about the efficacy of counterterrorism, particularly in terms of something which again has come up, how difficult it actually is? I raised this in my question to Nick Rasmussen a few moments ago, because it does seem to me that counterterrorism, as was pointed out in Martha Crenshaw and Gary Lefree's wonderful book recently, that it's a very difficult endeavour to engage in. And sometimes I think its underestimation, that difficulty, is something which makes it further more complicated. For example, if that framework is adopted, we can see that there are ways in which some of the successes of counterterrorism also contribute to intensifications of the thing they're trying to get rid of. You can have tactical successes which contribute to strategic blowback. In the case of Israel and Palestinian terrorism, in the case of the war on terrorism after the 9/11 atrocity, repeatedly in the case of the United Kingdom dealing with Irish terrorisms, in the case of the Spanish state dealing with ETA, in the case of the West German state dealing with the Baader-Meinhof group, there is a series of ways in which you can have tactical successes that can have blowback. I think Dan Byman is absolutely right that drones have a tactical and in some ways I think also a potentially strategic effect, which is benign for counterterrorism. It's also unquestionably true that drone attacks have had and continue to have a hearts and minds problem in some parts of Pakistan. Because we're being filmed, I'm not going to say what terrorists should do, because I don't want to be the guy who's cited in court where someone says, oh, that professor came up with this really good idea in Georgetown. But I've studied this stuff for so long, till my beard's gone grey, that I'd be rather good at this. And there are things you could do, which I'm happy to share afterwards over a coffee once the camera's off, in terms of ways in which the blowback could be accelerated. But it's unquestionably the case that the tactical successes that we sometimes have in counterterrorism as Western states have strategic blowback, which makes things more difficult. The United Kingdom is still paying legally, reputationally and financially for the effects of counter-terrorist endeavours in Africa in the 1950s and things which happened much earlier in Ireland. As Lord Carlisle wisely said when we met here a couple of days ago in relation to his experiences of Northern Ireland, there's no such thing as the past in Ireland because everything is present. Okay, it doesn't, and that came up in the session before. Okay, it's also true that in the literature there are other ways for thinking that counterterrorism is a very difficult endeavour to engage in. I mentioned the unrealistic public and political expectations that people expect you to get rid of terrorism rather than to contain it. They expect it to happen soon rather than late. So, last time I gave a talk in Georgetown was the same week as the current president's inaugural address when he was talking of getting rid of radical Islamist terrorism. It's not going to happen. Certainly not during his term of office, even if he gets re-elected, okay? But I can understand why somebody would want him to say it, okay? Because politically it makes sense. And it is interesting that there is a refusal to have a public debate which is honest about acceptable levels of violence. One of the British politicians dealing with Northern Ireland in the early 1970s was much maligned and remains most famous in being maligned for saying that there would become an acceptable level of violence in Northern Ireland. But actually what he said was crucial to the peace process in the sense that eventually the fact that it was an acceptable level of violence made it more difficult for the terrorists to win because people got used to it. But it's a very unpopular political thing to say. The stovepiping which was mentioned makes counter-terrorism much more difficult, and scholars have looked at that. And I think another point, and this is finishing my second question, another point is that it seems to me there is a confusion often in counter-terrorism that people are expected to deal with terrorism as if it's the problem, rather than treating it more accurately as a terrible bloodstained symptom of what the real problems tend to be, those problems being much more difficult to deal with. So where terrorism, as is still common, arises from questions of disputed state legitimacy, of self-determination, of fractures within or between religious faiths, terrorism isn't the problem. Terrorism is an appalling, callous, merciless consequence of the problem, and the problem isn't easy to resolve. Most terrorist organizations don't last very long. They don't do much damage. But the ones we're interested in are the ones that do arise from more serious political problems. And those political problems, it's very difficult for counter-terrorist practitioners to resolve. And I've often found that, for example, when I've been doing lectures to military audiences, I have a profound sense of the difficulty of the position they're put in doing counter-terrorism, because they're given the task often of dealing with a problem, when the problem is really one which even the politicians who sent them aren't able to deal with, hence they're sending soldiers into these life-threatening situations. So it is difficult for a whole series of reasons. I suppose what I'm suggesting is that if we look at the framework I'd elaborated at the start, or if you don't like mine, if you come up with your own, a framework which allows us to say it's not yes or no, it's not going to be this that works, that doesn't, but that there may be tensions between the tactically efficacious and the strategically effective. There may be tensions between what it's rewarding as a politician or a business person or an individual or a journalist or a citizen to say, and the effectiveness of what's going to be done in terms of saving life and limb. Lord Carlyle mentioned the PREVENT strategy, part of the contest strategy in the United Kingdom. Whatever the UK did in terms of trying to prevent terrorism, those authors who start by assuming PREVENT is bad and then criticise it would criticise the government. Because if the government tries to do something to PREVENT, they write articles in journals or in The Guardian saying it's terrible what they're doing, they're making things worse. But you can imagine if the UK government didn't do anything to try and prevent terrorism, those same people in those same journals and The Guardian newspaper would say, what's the government doing? It's never dealing with trying to prevent the problem in the first place. So it's a very difficult position that the state is in. And obviously anyone watching this will assume I'm some paid-up lackey of the state, but I'm not. I'm actually a critical friend, but I think it is important to recognise that that which is difficult can sometimes be eased if we have grown-up conversations about what's realistic. Third, where should the debate now go? And this is the third and final point. Where should the debate now go on the counter-terrorist efficacy? So you know what I'm saying is we do need a framework for looking at the complex layered ways in which it's going to work. Terrorists are normal, counter-terrorists are normal, and in any area of serious human endeavour, the answer to is it working is not going to be yes or no. No. Do universities work? Yeah. Does Catholicism work? To say yes or no, people would think you were a total idiot in the bar when you were talking to them. But I think what people expect sometimes is more simple answers than the complex ones of the layered framework. Because the things that you do, as in a career, in an academic career, you could do things which might work in some ways, but counterproductively damage you or other people in other ways. I think we also need to recognise metrics aren't enough when we're asking whether counterterrorism works. Okay? I'm a historian, maimed by studying history at Oxford in the 1980s, 1,000 years ago, right? Metrics aren't enough. It's not that metrics don't tell you something really important. They clearly do. And the sophisticated analysis of the metrics is something which produces insights which are tremendously enriching. But in anything, whether it's terrorism, counterterrorism, or climate change, the metrics aren't going to tell you everything because cultures, behaviours, legacies, and attitudes are going to be important in what you also analyse. We need both and. We need the quant and the qual. And I know one of the shifts in the literature academically recently towards the blending of the fabulously quantitatively sophisticated and the qualitatively sophisticated is something which I think I welcome because it shows how we can move forward. It's also true that the metrics are very difficult to rely on. So the Global Terrorism Database, which I have huge regard, I think is probably the best of the databases on terrorism. But actually many of the figures are just wrong. Okay, I've pointed this out before and it doesn't make me popular, but the Global Terrorism Database records for 1972 as the total number of terrorist incidents in the world, a significantly lower figure than is known to have occurred in Belfast alone in that year. Okay, and there are parts of, those of you who know, and some of you know this much better than I do, there are parts of Pakistan where it's very difficult to know exactly how much has been happening at all, let alone to have precise figures on exactly who's doing what to whom. The metrics are vital, but they're not going to be enough. So those people who say the war on terror didn't work because of these numbers, or this policy is working because of those numbers, it'll be part of the answer, but not enough. And my final point in answer to this question of where the debate should go is I think we do need a geographically multi-locational set of answers. It's terrorisms, not terrorism, that we're dealing with. And therefore it'll be counter-terrorisms, not counter-terrorism, that we're dealing with. It's not that there are no family resemblances between terrorisms, manifestly there are. It's not that there are no family resemblances or cross-learnings between counter-terrorisms, clearly there are. But it is the case that terrorism remains in many profound ways, despite its internationalization and despite foreign fighters and despite these wretched phones that we all have, in many ways it remains determined by profoundly local context. And Ben, in the first session for the conference, talked about the importance of intuitions and knowledge about local context, and it's incredibly important. Much went right in the post-9/11 period of counterterrorism, and God bless those of you who were involved in it. It saved life and limb, and it's a wonderful thing, and I applaud it. Much that went wrong could have been lessened in its wrongness by greater contextual sophistication of understanding about that which was plausible in the context within which things happened. And that would have saved a lot of lives and a lot of limbs, and we still haven't paid the cost for the blowback for some of that in terms of terrible things yet to happen. We need, therefore, to look at the ways in which the case study expertise, and this, you all know people like this in practitioner world, in academic world. There are people at one end of the continuum who are only interested in one thing. They're obsessed with Peruvian terrorism. And whatever you ask them about, it comes back to Peru. It just doesn't matter. You talk about restaurants to go to, football tournaments, film festivals, you're back to Peru. And they know everything about Peru. And they know everything about, but they don't care about anything else. And at the other end of the continuum, there's people who know about 600 cases of terrorism, and they've got fantastic maths about how to deal with that. But they couldn't name 4 people in the shining path. Okay? Now, both of these are wonderful ways of looking at the world, but you need them both in dialogue with each other. Similarly, you need to look at that which is unique in a particular case study. There are some things, I've spent so much time in Belfast. Despite my accent and surname, I was born in West Belfast, and I spent so long there. I know far too much about who does what. When I get to the end of a book, I always start dreaming about the people I'm writing about. And when I was finishing my book on the IRA, I had a dream about going on holiday with the Brighton bomber. And I woke up and said to my wife, I've just had this dream about going on holiday with I won't name him, but you all know who he was. And my wife said, finish the book, Rich. Finish the book. It's time to get it over with. But there are ways in which you know about everything about people in the intimate context, but you need to look at the cross-referencing as well, and that context is crucial because we do need multi-locational answers. Okay? Even if you look at an organization like ISIS, the ISIS fellow traveler who does something in Western Europe, the foreign fighter who goes to fight, and the people who are locally recruited and the variations within them, those are different counter-terrorist requirements that you're going to be dealing with. So, in closing, what am I saying? I think we need inclusive dialogue. I think this conference is a wonderful example of that between different countries, different academic disciplines, between practitioners, between people who have had experience of many different kinds. You need dialogue of that kind. I'm arguing that what we need, if we're asking the question, does counterterrorism work, we need to look at it in terms of a framework which admits the complexity and sophistication of the answer we're going to get and not have simple answers. We need to look at those ways in which scholars and others have identified why it is as difficult as it is and use the understanding of the difficulties to make it easier for people who are doing it to save life and limb. And I think we need to look at where the debate can go next in terms of a sophisticated framework, in terms of utilizing but not being in themselves satisfied by the metrics, in terms of a multi-locational geographical sophistication. Because I think as we in this conference are looking at the current threat landscape, we're always thinking about, as historians, the past, in the conference, the present, but the future is always the most important thing. And we want the next decade, the next 100 years, to have people's precious lives and limbs saved. And I think if we think honestly and systematically about the degree to which and the reasons for which counterterrorism does and does not work, then the jobs of all of us will be made easier. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard, for serving up a typically rich and multi-layered gatto of analysis, and also for being brave enough to throw in the conceptual hand grenade of Reggie Maudlin, the British Home Secretary's infamous quote from 1972 about what might be an acceptable level of violence. His other comment on Northern Ireland was rather less optimistic. What a bloody awful country, get me another scotch, he said as he got on the plane on the way back, infamously. On which note, let's throw it open to the floor.
Just on that one, the IRA newspaper responded, he was famously, he came to Belfast and saw this place that's falling apart with awful violence and miserable rain, and as he was getting on the plane, as Tim said, he said, what an awful country, get me a scotch. The IRA newspaper the next week said, yes, but who made it a bloody awful country? So it was quite a good answer.
At the back, sir.
Keeping in mind your assertion that metrics are not enough and your complementary suggestion that behaviors and attitudes and customs and culture and use of language would play greatly into coming to know the terrorist actor and to understand him or her more deeply, I want to hearken back to Dr. Buchanan's comments from yesterday where he highlighted the disparity between the advancement of digital technology in collecting biometrics and nearly eliminating anonymity, certainly disturbing alias level cover, and ask if you could say something about that relationship, and also highlight perhaps the value of humans and how it might continue to be collected effectively despite the digital advancements.
Thank you, Dan. Richard, would you rather take single questions?
I'll take a group if that's okay.
Fine. Let's take another couple then.
Thanks very much. Richard, coming back to your point about terrorism being a symptom of a deeper issue, I wonder if you could talk briefly about the role of empathy in counterterrorism and how difficult that might be given what they do. Thank you.
Thank you. We take a third? Or are there enough there for you to feast on?
I'll start with those, and Dan may want to come in as well. I mean, I was very struck when Ben spoke yesterday about those things which technology can facilitate, and I think clearly those should be utilised and are utilised in ways which are very exciting. I suppose what I'd want to do would be, as I think he was saying something along these lines also, is not to throw out the human interaction which is involved in terms of various different levels that it can give. And I'll highlight a couple of things. One is the gathering of information from individuals, and one thing we do know that we know is that torturing people is not a particularly reliable way of acquiring actionable intelligence, whereas a cigarette and a cup of tea and building a relationship frequently can be. And I think quite often, whether you're talking to the CIA or to the old IUC or whatever, what often happens is that when individuals begin to get relationships, which is difficult, which is painful, not only do you acquire intelligence about that individual, which might save lives through operational tactical things, but you also gain understandings about the nature of the movement, and it also really damages the movement itself when you get that human intelligence. So if this was an IRA meeting in 1989, I'd say at least a dozen of you would have been informers. Now, after a while, that has all sorts of effects. Both the IRA and the IUC gave me the same figures for how many IRA operations were planned but thwarted because of information, much of it human intelligence acquired, and it was over half. But also, if Tim and Dan and I have been in an active service unit, and then we begin to wonder, well, how committed is Wilson actually to the project? Never used to have any money at the bar. Always seems to have money now. What is that? Is he getting paid? Now he never used to go and play football on a Thursday. Is he really playing football, or is he meeting his handler? You begin to have doubts. I've got a lot of photos from the 1970s of groups of IRA people. 2 decades later, almost all of those group photos, one person ended up being an informer, and it eats away at millennial stuff. And that personal information is stuff where you get things in addition to bugs, in addition to digital. So I would say the human stuff is important. Though you ask also, how do you gather it? There'll be people in this room who know more about that than I do, but it seems to me that it involves patience and intimacy of understanding. And it comes to Donald's question, which is about empathy. And there are 2 answers to that, and neither of them's easy. I am frequently criticised for being overly empathic in my work about terrorism. My book, which I've just advised you to buy, was described by one reviewer as being morally repellent because it showed too much empathy for the people and treated them as humans who'd done these merciless things. I tend to think that empathy doesn't involve endorsement at all. And I think that in any human engagement, empathy is a crucial, in the sort of the way that the psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen would look at it, where he'd say, understanding that which you seem to feel and what's appropriate to respond to you on the basis of how you're feeling. That doesn't necessitate that I think the merciless act you carried is in any way legitimate. It just means I'm understanding you. So as a scholar, I think it's important, but it's not uncontentious. And there is a school of thought that thinks that if you present terrorists as somehow beyond any kind of normal human frame, that's better. The other thing I would say, though, is that in practitioner terms, I think empathy is something which can come back to the first question, which can be the best way of countering them. I mean, understanding that which people are really doing, why they're doing it, how committed they really are after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, which of people in the movement, if you meet them, are really more likely to be committed and which are going to do a deal. Empathy can involve understanding those personal details, which people have a gambling problem, which people have an alcohol problem, which people have got PTSD already, which people have been sleeping with someone else's girlfriend while they were in jail. All of those kind of things where you understand the human bits of what they do seems to me to be important, not just analytically as a mere professor, but professionally in terms of gathering information. So I'm in favour of empathy. But, set against that, you have to say, well, look at the horrific consequences of what people do. I suppose I tend to approach it more in the way that what's the outworking of this going to be in the future? Can we stop people being killed in the future? If that means being more empathic about people who've done awful things, that might help. And I would say quite often, getting people to turn away from terrorism seems to me to involve them being treated as human beings.
Dan.
Just a very brief addition on the human intelligence point. Historically, and still today, one of the biggest advantages of human intelligence was it was interactive, right? So when you're listening to someone on the phone trying to get information, it is somewhat disturbing to the people on the phone if a voice suddenly rings out and says, "Hey, would you mind going into a bit more detail on that point?" Right? You get which is available to you. While if you're whether interrogating someone in a station house or jail, or whether it's a spy who's engaging with someone or an asset, then you can ask questions, right? The back and forth. What's changed though is the tremendous volume of communication that is not person-to-person communication via voice, right? But is instead electronic. So the amount of human communication is staggering, right? Professor Buchanan gave figures on the amount of data generated in the last 2 years, right? So right there, much of that in counterterrorism terms would fall under SIGINT, right? But also how people communicate. And I have teenage boys, and it's perfectly normal for them to be sitting next to a person, communicating on a phone with the person next to them when they're on an app or somehow sharing something, as if that's normal human interaction, which I think it now is, right? I think my view that that's insane and they should put their phones away is outdated. And so a lot of that back and forth, a lot of that interrogation, I actually think will increasingly come in I'll say, electronic forms. That doesn't change the nature of it being back and forth, but it does change how you would collect it.
Thank you very much. Let's get another round of questions in. Lord Campbell, and then is there any women in the audience? We've been very male-dominated yet again. Okay, I'm not going to exclude the men, so let's take that second one.
Thank you so much. So far, the panel's been talking a lot more about kinetic operations, CT operations. I'd just like to ask your opinions on CVE, and how does that fit into CT, especially understanding the ISIS refugee camps in Al-Hol and the things that we're going to face in the future. Do you think it's effective? What are its challenges? And yeah, what do you see of it in the future? Thank you.
We'll just take a question at the front there, please, and then we'll go to answers.
Given what you obviously know about Northern Ireland, why did Blair succeed where John Major and even Willie Whitelaw had not been able to do so? Was it because of empathy? I mean, Blair had a reputation for being empathetic. Sometimes this was held against him by members of his own party for other reasons that you will readily understand. But having created that relationship between McGuinness and Paisley, how could it have possibly survived without empathy between them?
Okay, does anyone want to jump in and add that third question? Yeah, in the midway back there, please. Oh, sorry, take a second. We'll catch you in the next round, if that's all right.
Nick mentioned a concern about resource balancing, and given the conversation that both Dan and Richard have had in terms of how you look at our successes and our failures and the gaps in both the quantitative research and the mix of qualitative, are you concerned about overselling our progress in some cases, and that underserving the academic community that we're so dependent on to tell that truth to power?
Okay, I'm sure that's more than enough for you both to be getting on with. So Dan, do you want to lead this time?
Sure, I'll tackle a few. So on the countering violent extremism question, in general, those programs tend not to be too rigorously studied. Right? So we have a number of experiments in a number of different places, and they use different data. There are very different entry standards, right? Some are voluntary, some are told to go by courts. It's hard to control for things like the appeal of a group. So the Islamic State was tremendously compelling in 2015, not so much in 2018. So a CVE program may succeed at one stage where it wouldn't succeed at another. And often they're done as kind of a throwaway to prove to people that you don't just want to kill and imprison people, so they're not particularly well funded. President Obama, people often criticize President Trump for defunding some of these. They were incredibly poorly funded under President Obama. Right? So it's not as if this is a sea change, right? These were not taken seriously, in my view, under the previous administration and still are not today. I personally am a believer in trying them just because even a relatively small degree of success can be tremendously beneficial. And I also think it's important from a human point of view, really, to try to rehabilitate people when possible. But this goes back to a point that Richard made earlier, which was you have to have some degree of tolerance for failure, right? Which is, you're going to fail a lot in these programs. The question is overwhelmingly or just occasionally. But either way, there's going to be tremendous political risk. And that's something you have to accept if you're going to do CVE. I think you'll fail as well if you're putting people in jail all the time. But that said, that entails much less political risk. Amy's question is a really, really interesting one. And I think the resource balancing one is more than fair enough, right? And there tends to be, I don't know if problem is the right word, but there are relatively few Bruce Hoffmans in the world, right? There are relatively few people who have been devoting their careers and tremendous expertise to a subject. And there's a temptation always to kind of address the next issue. And some of the best academic people are the people who have gone very deep on the peruse of the world or on particular methods, right? And they may have decades of oblivion, and then Peru matters tremendously, and you really want that person. Something the academic world, I think, doesn't do particularly well is to reward a high degree of specialization in an area that's of less interest, right? And that's, in part chance. We have a wonderful scholar here at Georgetown, Christine Fair, who is a specialist on Pakistan, among other things. And she says, it's not that she focused on Pakistan because she thought 9/11 would happen and people would care about her region. She just found it a fascinating part of the world. And we need to reward people to kind of have that deep engagement. And I think we're moving away from that and that deep area studies model. And that's unfortunate, in my view.
Thank you, Dan. Richard?
Thanks. Again, excellent questions. On countering violent extremism, I would agree with what Dan has said, and I'd add in 2 quick points on it. One is the difficulty is that often populations, and particularly the media, focus on a wrong turn. So as was in the case recently in England, if you have somebody who's seemingly being rehabilitated and then commits murder, people kind of point at it as if, look, you can't do anything with these people. Whereas the visibility of success is less striking. I think that's one of the challenges for counterterrorism in general. If you stop a lot of plots, it's kind of page 4 of the newspaper. If bomb goes off, there's an inquiry saying, why didn't you stop it? And there's a sort of paradox there. I think the other thing is that some of the analysis, certainly from academics, and I would condemn my own tribe, this goes back to Alex Carlisle's point, a lot of the evaluation there has been of these programs is where people start out with what they think is the answer and then find evidence that seems to validate what they thought was the answer in the first place. Whereas I think if you start out with as much of a Cartesian paring away of what you think you know and work up from there, it could be useful. And I would say that it's worth doing. I think it's also worth doing for the optics. I think it shows that you're doing something which is not just kinetic. I think that's useful. On Northern Ireland and Lord Campbell's question, I think that the relationships that were built up in various ways did make a difference. I think the relationship between the prime ministers in the UK and Ireland, whether Major and Reynolds initially, then Blair and Ahern. I think that Tony Blair's chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, who, as chief of staff for the UK Prime Minister, it's a brave thing to agree to put a hood on your head, get in a cab with IRA men and go and meet them and have discussions, and there were risks in that physically. And I think the relationships that were built up there did build trust and possibility. Central to Blair succeeding was making it a priority, which now looks like people now think, it was inevitable, it was going to happen. Didn't seem inevitable at the time, and there were risks, and good for him for doing that. I think central to it also was the fact that the main terrorist groups, and certainly their leaderships, had come to the conviction that violence wasn't bringing the victory they had thought it would, but was bringing an enduring stalemate, and were quite practical and looking for a way out. But then the UK government and the Irish government had to give a creative way for them to get out, and that was difficult. So I think there were various different layers, but central to it was the fact that, thankfully, terrorism turned out not to be delivering the highest level of success, and they therefore looked for alternative ways of doing it. But then the relationships, which took time to build, did allow for that to develop. It's interesting, the peace process in Northern Ireland, depending on when you start it, took about as long as the war process. It's a very long thing to do, and it therefore involves patience. And patience comes to Amy's question as well. I mean, as a deputy president of a university, I would always like to say for the microphone that the more governments invest in universities, the better for everybody on the planet. And I think the more the money comes to academics who are studying things, the better. The two things I'd pick on particularly, I think Dan's absolutely right. What you need is people studying stuff not because it's fashionable. I mean, one of the difficulties with terrorism is it tends towards a solipsism of the present, that we're obsessed with this now. So, it was all Al-Qaeda. And then it was like Al-Qaeda is all ISIS. And then it was, whereas what you need to do is say these things are always worth studying because of the things you can lastingly know. I always say to my graduate students, however contemporary the thing about which you're writing, write about it in such a way that long after people aren't interested in it as news, the insights you offer are ones which are still valuable, and the best scholarly work that's done is insightful long after the news headlines have changed. I also think, not just because we're sitting where we are, I think centres which enduringly study this stuff when it comes in and out of fashion are important. I mean, CSTPV, the oldest such centre in Europe, certainly one of the oldest in the world, and I think that to keep that going into the future, whether or not interest in terrorism gains fame or loses it, is important. And I think that's where the case study stuff is really important. You really want someone, whether it's an academic or a person from the Foreign Office or the State Department, you want someone who kind of knows the stuff inside out, as well as the people who can cross-reference. But for that, you have to resource it. I would say university scholars, certainly historians, are a lot cheaper than the kit it takes to send an army somewhere. And you can often... politicians, I find sometimes that they'll sort of look politely at me, and then when I talk about how what I'm arguing for might be not only more effective but cheaper, they'll sort of say that again, Professor. There's a way in which that can be quite useful, and quite often you can get some eccentric weirdo who's studied Syria forever, who's actually quite useful to you. And I think sometimes, as long as they're brilliant, they just leave them in a university being weird and then use them when you need them. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. I just like to...
Queen's University Belfast's new mission statement.
Yeah.
I'd like to clarify. There was a woman about back, three-quarters back. Could we just take your question, please, and then we'll move to Lord Carlisle on the other side, please.
Thank you for your presentations. I wanted to ask if you were to identify the major unintended consequences of CT in the past 20 years, which would those be? And another question is regarding the transformation that sometimes terrorism goes through. It starts with, as a result of a major social problem, whatever it may be, and then it turns into a business, and it continues as such, and then it's more difficult to tackle it. So I don't know if you can comment on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we can take it over the other side, please. Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask a question which is sort of about Northern Ireland. Do you agree that we can learn a lot from Northern Ireland in terms of methodology, how to use human intelligence sources? What you call empathy, Richard, I would call detailed behavioral analysis and its use. It may amount to the same thing. But having learned those methodological lessons from Northern Ireland, do we really learn anything at all that's more generally useful from Northern Ireland, given that the two sides in Northern Ireland shared a very different view of democracy, but at least they shared a view of democracy, broadly speaking. There was no suggestion of a caliphate in Northern Ireland, and therefore the issues of Northern Ireland really cannot be compared in narrative terms with the issues of Salafist terrorism, at least.
I will not comment on Northern Ireland. I have read Richard's book, so I am somewhat knowledgeable, but I'll stop.
Books or anything else.
When I'm next to the author. A few thoughts on the unintended consequences of counterterrorism, right? A lot depends what you want to throw into that realm. So one obvious thing to me is the Iraq War. It's very hard for me to imagine the U.S. decision to invade Iraq in 2003 without 9/11 and the subsequent concerns about counterterrorism. It's a jumble of causality, right? It's not one thing. There are people before and after, but that war had tremendous consequences, not only, of course, for Iraq, not only for the Middle East, but also for the United States, how it was perceived in the world, how Americans perceived their own government. And to me, that was one that was largely negative And certainly I would put in that category. Another is a change in how immigration is viewed in the United States and much of Europe, where there were always nativist concerns, there were always economic concerns. But now a national security concern has come into the debate as well. And I think in many cases that was a tipping point. Right? And in the United States in particular, the United States historically had a tremendous openness to immigrants and refugees. And that's changed. And I think part of that, not all of that, but part of that is because of national concern, security concerns related to terrorism, even though empirically those are really not founded. But nevertheless, in fact, the finding is usually that immigrants do raise terrorism, but they raise actually white supremacist terrorism, not terrorism from the immigrant community. But nevertheless, I think that's a big consequence because that has huge consequences for hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. And the last, I don't quite know where to put this one squarely, is the question of military deployments around the world for extended periods of time. Right? I think if you said on September 12, 2001, President Bush and other senior leaders, the United States is still going to be in Afghanistan. There's going to be significant US forces in a number of Middle Eastern countries. There'll be small deployments in Africa and around the world with no end in sight. Right? Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that's unsustainable. I actually think that's sustainable in a military sense. But there is, to me, a question of, is it politically sustainable? And how do we talk about that? How do we think about that? And to me, the question, again, of the acceptable level of terrorism, the question to me of how do we think about risk, we haven't really had those debates, so it leads to the bad guys are in Niger, we should be there as well sort of instinct. And it's hard to temper that if there isn't a broader political debate. And unfortunately to me, that has led to a backlash against US internationalism in general, right? Where there's a sense of the United States solving the world's problems by itself, which was never true. But that perception, I think, became much stronger, unfortunately. And that has, I think, damaged the United States in a number of ways outside counterterrorism.
I would agree with what Dan said. I think adding into the Iraq War legacy in regard to terrorism, while the emergence of ISIS was multi-causal and tangled, part of it related to the things which in the region had happened as a consequence of what happened after the invasion and international responses to it, including Western responses from my own and from this country. So I think that's significant. On the changing nature of terrorism is also a very good question, because just as with wars, the things that make things start and the things that sustain them are often only partially overlapping circles. So for example, once an organization is up and running and involved in a serious campaign of terrorism, organizational dynamics take on their own kind of self-sustaining quality. The tit-for-tat escalation of violence between you and your adversaries can eclipse ideological motivation and initial causation. Crime can become a part of it. I generally think that terrorist organizations that are interesting to us because they're important are not solely explicable because of crime, but crime is always involved. I mean, there's the crime of terrorism, but there's always other kind of crime involved for various people, and that can become a rather good motivation for carrying on a campaign after the strategic legitimation of it seems to have waned a bit. So I think recognizing what it is that the people involved in terrorism are really wanting and being honest about the actual causes is crucial. I think sometimes we misdiagnose and send our analysis to the wrong address, and there are sometimes comforting notions, they're all crazy, probably not. They hate us for our freedoms, turned out that wasn't it. They're just gangsters with no political support, probably not true of the groups we care about. And I think being honest about why people in multi-causal ways do what they do is an important basis for effective counterterrorism, and that might change over time. Eventually, most terrorist groups get to the point that I described in answering Lord Campbell's question about the IRA, where what they thought was going to work turns out not to be working in the way they thought it would, and at that point you have an option, possibly, for engagement. On Northern Ireland, I think that every terrorist group is unique. And therefore understanding them in terms of their own uniqueness is the starting point. It's also true, though, that every human being in this room is unique, and yet the things which are medically relevant if you go to the doctor between all of us are ones which you wouldn't ignore. And in counterterrorism, I think there are things which might be cross-referenced. So you mentioned the running of informers or getting human intelligence. Actually, I think many of the things in terms of how you gain high-grade intelligence and use it that were painfully learned by people like Jonathan Evans, whom we heard yesterday in Northern Ireland, equally relevant in terms of jihadist terrorism, equally relevant in terms of other groups. I think in Northern Ireland, the UK state painfully learnt that exaggerating what you could do through military methods probably was going to be counterproductive and actually generate more recruits than it would extirpate the problem. In Northern Ireland, as in the war on terror after 9/11, there was a short-termism. People thought it could be dealt with more quickly than it was. In Northern Ireland, there was an ignoring of some of the things that legally we should treat as precious. There was a mistreatment of prisoners. That's had blowback. Again, that's something which had echoes after the 9/11 atrocity in terms of things which are famous in the mistreatment of people who were incarcerated. So I think there are things which, albeit I agree in very different contexts, you can translate. On the business of Al-Qaeda wanting something different from the IRA, absolutely agree with you, and Hamas wanting something different again, and FARC wanting something different again. All I would say is that there's a thing which is similar between them, which is when the nastiest of the violence is going on, these groups are presented as being people who are irrational, inexplicable, with whom you can't do business. I, as my accent indicates, grew up in England most of the time. In the 1970s and early 1980s, the IRA were they were just gangsters. These people were criminals. That's what the official policy was, that these were criminals. You couldn't talk to them. They were impossibilists. They want this impossible thing. Now, whether or not you think it was impossible to give them a united Ireland, which I think would have been very difficult to do, after the peace process happened, people said, well, the IRA were okay, sent a warning before the bomb, but this Al-Qaeda bunch, totally impossible to deal with. There's nothing you can do with them. And they're totally irrational. They want this crazy caliphate. Actually, a lot of what Al-Qaeda wanted was to do with attitudes towards American foreign policy in Muslim countries. It was to do with attitudes towards the legitimacy or illegitimacy of regimes in Muslim countries, which people might have very different views and will have very different views from them on, but are not in themselves beyond some kind of explanation. Bob Pape at Chicago has talked about the ways in which much suicide bombing is motivated by a desire to get rid of military occupying forces from elsewhere. That's not an entirely unrecognisable impulse. So I agree with you, Alex, that each case is different. I wouldn't want to say because this happened in Northern Ireland you can transplant it, but I do think in terms of counter-terrorist methods, there are things which states are well to remember, not to forget. And I think the amnesia was a problem. So, for example, whether you're reading what neuroscientists say about what happens to your brain when you're tortured, whether you're talking to the CIA, the IUC, the FBI, or anyone, we know if I want to get information about someone who I think is a terrorist, I'd like to say he's not a terrorist, but my friend at the front of the road, if I thought he was a terrorist, what I'd want would not be to torture him and ask for information. I'd want to build a relationship. And the British state learnt that very painfully in Northern Ireland, and then slightly put that on the back burner a bit for a time. And I think learning these things is something that states we shouldn't. It goes back to the point Nick was mentioning. We shouldn't forget what the people involved in our community know. And I think it's a difficult thing. Christopher Andrew, in his authorised history of MI5, the UK Security Service, when he was researching MI5, he noticed that in the 1970s, when MI5 was looking at Ireland, it had no reference in its files to the things that the UK had done in Ireland in the 1920s. And he coined this phrase where he said it was historical attention span deficit disorder. And he said, it's quite a nice little phrase. And he's not criticising them, he's just saying, we often forget that which we know. And I think probably there are things we could have learned.
Donald Rumsfeld famously talked about known knowns, unknown unknowns, known unknowns, but I think very often I would agree with Richard that there's also the unknown knowns, things we once knew but we just forgot. The London bomb squad of the police in the early 70s went looking for the files from the last IRA bombing campaign in 1939. The empty shelves stared back at them. No one had thought it worth keeping. Peter, in the front.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Richard. I bite with regard to torture. Not that I condone torture, not that I ever tortured anybody, maybe my students with essay questions, whatever. But the question is then, if torture is so inefficient as a question method, why is it still around? And if you would ask, for example, he's dead already, Paul Ossores, a captain in the French army in the time of the Battle of Algiers and then general, until his very last day in life, he said torture was effective. We completely destroyed the FLN in Algiers. Everybody knew we have 24 hours because that's the time they had to hold out until the cells were reorganized. So you had to crush them very quickly. And he said, we got actionable information very, very quickly. So it works. Is it not just our squeamishness and tiptoeing around waterboarding, is the torture or not or whatever? Is it just our civil liberties, basically our liberal democracy squeamishness? Does it not work if you simply completely forget for a second human rights and all that stuff? As I said, I don't condone torture, but I've heard from some students who have been there and done it, that it actually works like a charm. Tea and cigarette, as I said, takes a lot of time. You don't always have that.
I had an office across the corridor from this guy for several years. I never quite knew his attitude to torture as well as I now do. So I have three answers on it. I mean, clearly, sometimes it has effectiveness, okay, but many times it doesn't. And the instant of the classic notion that you know where the bomb is and when it's going to go off and what the code is that'll stop it, and the only way I can find out in 10 minutes is to torture you. That's quite rare. More commonly, you're looking for things where patience is required. And if I know that you know all those things through other sources, I possibly know what the code is also. I think you're right. So there's that. Second thing is, I think one of the interesting things, there has been some research done on this, is a lot of popular cultural and political perceptions about these things are affected by what we see in films and television. Okay, and in the films and the TV series and so on, it does work, because what happens if I want to find out from you, I torture you, you tell me, otherwise you wouldn't. I think the evidence from people who've engaged in counterterrorism suggests that mostly it's ineffective in terms of getting that information, but when Liam Neeson or Jack Bauer or someone does it on television, it works. But I think that does affect how we think about it, because that's often when people see information that shapes their views. The third thing is the most painful one, which is that, and it goes back to something I said earlier, there's more going on in counterterrorism than countering terrorism. Okay, so yeah, I may not get the information from you that I want by beating you, but if you're one of them and you've been shooting at my mates and I've just gone to that funeral of my friend, actually, I don't care whether you tell me something or not. I just want to whack you a bit, and this is a chance for me to do it. And I feel I'm in charge, and I'm seeing you screaming, and your teeth are getting kicked out, whatever. And I think there is an element of that. So when people say torture works, I sometimes think it's not so much that getting information that'll save lives, but it might be that there are other things where you think, I've finally got one of these blokes, and I might actually have some result. And that's a very human thing. I mean, counter-terrorists are human too. And when we look at what Louise Richardson, our former boss at St Andrews, in her wonderful book, What Terrorists Want, talks about the importance of revenge in motivating terrorists. But obviously, if counter-terrorists are human too, if people have been killing soldiers or killing your friends or your police officers or citizens, you might want to lash out at someone. I don't condone it, but I think there's empathy required there too. But I don't deny that on some occasions it might work. But I think neither you nor I would be quite as cavalier as your devil's advocate question suggested about the human rights stuff, because there is huge blowback from those transgressions.
I'll only add on the blowback question, the FLN is actually a great question, right? Because as I'm sure you know, the French public turned against what would be called the occupation of Algeria, right? It became an occupation as opposed to administering part of France. And part of that was the French public perception that they were becoming a country of torturers, right? That the word spread since it was so pervasive. And the ability to maintain the moral high ground is not only important because we want to be on the moral high ground as human beings, but politically. And that question is something that is necessary to sustain very painful, long counterinsurgency struggles. So I think there's an immediate moral question. There are practicality questions, but then there's a broader strategic question as well.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Bruce.
Sure.
Yep.
I mean, and that's actually a subtext of whether terrorism works or not. It's that who controls the narrative? And the IRA always had a very good narrative, which helped them enormously, which we didn't discuss. But in the case of Algeria, I mean, the FLN tortured heinously far more Algerians, their own kith and kin, their own religious brethren, than the French ever did. But the difference was they controlled the narrative, and it was the occupation force, and they were able to reach an audience in Paris the same way, arguably, the IRA by the 90s was able to reach an audience in London. And actually, since we're on Northern Ireland, let me make one other point. It's interesting that in all our discussions and the questions from Lord Campbell and Lord Carlisle about what worked and what didn't, CVE, though, neither of you mentioned CVE, especially you, Richard, and even Tim, who studied Northern Ireland so intensely. I mean, at least when I've posed that question to former IRA people, or also people in the police force and intelligence, I mean, they've laughed at me, and they said, of course CVE wouldn't work. You're talking about a hardcore Republican sentiment that, as you pointed out, Richard, your interlocutor in New York, said goes back to the 12th century. What possible CVE was there, except for some concessions? And I would argue that the concessions, after all, Margaret Thatcher started negotiating with the IRA shortly after she was nearly blown up in Brighton in 1984. So the negotiations were long-standing. I would take a harder line, perhaps, and say that what drove the process to fruition in the 1990s was something that you mentioned in passing, but I think deserves more attention, was firstly and don't forget, this is 30 years, and this is part of the United Kingdom. It took 30 years to get to a peace treaty, so the 20 years we've been in Afghanistan is nothing yet. But the point is, what drove, I think, the process was threefold. Firstly, it was intelligence, and I think you underestimate that. 1 out of 10 people in the photograph would have been informers. When you read Steak Knife and various accounts of even people at the highest echelons of the IRA who were informants, it may have been 9 out of 10 that were actually informing. So this was tremendous intelligence success. It was also, I would argue too, especially in the early 1990s, the combination of kinetics. When the conventional army was pulled back, much as I would argue was the case in Iraq in 2007 and 2008, and you had very intelligence-driven operations by the SAS, by elite forces, that were also hammering the IRA, and that it wasn't necessarily that the IRA saw that there was an absence of support in the populace. I think that was definitely there, because also this was a period when there was the Oslo Accords, the settlement of the conflict in South Africa, and I think people in Northern Ireland thought, why not here? So that helped too. But I think it was pivotally that the IRA was weakened, and it was weakened kinetically, and it was weakened by intelligence-driven operations. There was never CVE. What I think was the non-kinetic role was the tremendous financial investment that happened in the province that raised the standard of living, and also the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws in housing and employment that began to convince the population that maybe terrorism wasn't the way. But I don't think there were plenty of military and kinetic missteps, certainly in the first 20 years. But I think what stands out in the last 10 years, at least from my view, and please correct me, there was no CVE, it was intelligence-driven, there were kinetic operations basically by elite special operations forces that were very targeted, and there was the economic infusion that convinced people you could actually prosper in more peaceful times and get Game of Thrones tour buses clogging the streets.
There's a lot of that I would agree with, actually, Bruce, and it chimes with much of my work. I suppose on the informers, I'd say 2 or 3 out of 10. And that's a good result, I think. And I think that did make a difference in terms of morale, in terms of operations, in terms of putting a ceiling on things. It didn't get to the point where the terrorist organizations couldn't carry on, but it did thwart their efficacy. I think that's where the issue of whether terrorism works or not was affected. And crucially for states, in fighting terrorism, you've got to demonstrate that you're going to fight longer than they will, and you're just going to keep going. And the British state did that. And I think you're right also that there was a multi-methods approach. There were occasional whackings, there was imprisonment, there was intelligence, there was an attempt to reform the fair employment legislation, there was economic transformation, there was a zeitgeist, there were plate tectonic shifts happening in the world. Apartheid was ending, the Cold War was ending, so there seemed to be possibility of peace in the Middle East. And all of those things, some of which the UK government can control, some of which it couldn't, did make a difference. At the heart of it, though, I think it's also true that, two final points on that, and I'll say something about the CV very quickly. The kinetic methods that they used did have an effect. Some IRA people were taken out. But interestingly, the UK is now going through a process of a lot of inquiries into that sort of stuff, which is undermining the UK and strengthening Sinn Féin, because they've now got freedom of information requests to say, well, I'll bring back Dr. Lair, the torturer. Dr. Lair was there at that ambush. What did he really know? What do we now know that he knows? And so there is so it cut both ways. And I also think that in the end, the issue of the support of the population for the IRA was partly because the efficacy wasn't there. In other words, they're prepared to tolerate things if it's going to work, but it was just going on and on and on. Are there rewards in peace? Which there were. So I think we're in agreement on that. But I would say the informers probably 2 or 3 out of 10, and the military methods were ambiguous. The CVE is really interesting. The one part of the United Kingdom where the prevent strategy doesn't operate is the one part of the United Kingdom where there's been endemic terrorism for about 50 years, Northern Ireland, right? And the reason for this is because it couldn't possibly work in Northern Ireland, because my wife is a psychologist. If we lived in England and one of her patients or clients showed signs of sympathy for radical views, which might show a sympathy for terrorism, she'd have to report it to the police. In Northern Ireland, you have to report virtually everybody, because people would have views which are perfectly normal views for people to hold about the legitimacy of one or other kind of violence. Now, at the university in Queens, we don't have to. We're not subject to the same prevent legislation that you would be in England, because like most of my students, I'd have to be ringing up the police, and that would be a very mistaken thing to do for all sorts of reasons. So I think that is interesting. So yes, the Countering Violent Extremism was trying to produce a solution to terrorism, which was partly based on imprisonment, intelligence, policing, other changes around the world, changing demography, changing economic possibilities. The difficulty with it is, as you suggest, Bruce, it takes a very long time, and a lot of those things are things you can't control. You know, you happen to have an American president who, for various reasons, got more involved than would normally be the case. You had, at that stage, difficult to think of it now, but at that stage you had good relations within the EU between Ireland and the United Kingdom. So those things were things which were gifts. All I'd say is when you do get an opportunity to make those kinds of progress, what Mr. Blair did was try and seize the day, and I think he did the right thing.
On which stirring note, I'm going to indulge my inner Genghis Khan and bring things to a halt. Thank you for a wide-ranging and excellent discussion. I'm struck perhaps by the heretical thought of just how difficult it is to measure success in counterterrorism and how the victories of counterterrorism are often invisible by definition. They're the violence that doesn't happen, which in a strange way resembles the sort of victories of idealistic grassroots peace movements, the kind of sandal wearers who are often told they're entirely utopian. So on that note, I think I'll wrap it up, but we've worked our speakers hard. If we could just thank them before you recaffeinate, that would be great.